Discover Geography, Lesson 6-1, Global Inequality. We live in a highly unequal world. When we look at the income levels of people in different parts of the world, we see some stark divides. Currently, the World Bank estimates that there are about 1.3 billion people in the world living on less than $1.25 a day. Now, there are only 7 billion total people in the world, so that's a huge proportion of our world's population living in fairly extreme poverty. And this economic inequality is unevenly distributed around the world. Here we see the average GDP levels, so we'll talk a little bit later about exactly what GDP is. It's roughly a measure of economic wealth. And what we see is that we have some parts of the world, like North America and Western Europe, where the GDP per capita is in the range of $50,000 a year per person. Other parts of the world, like Africa and large parts of Asia, have GDP per capita in the range of $1,000 per person per year. So we have some pretty major inequalities between different parts of the world. We have big divides between the rich parts of the world and the poor parts of the world. Attempts to address this divide are referred to as development. The idea of development was put on the international agenda by U.S. President Harry Truman in his second inaugural address. At this point in time, he had been re-elected to serve a new term of his own after having finished out what would have been FDR's fourth term. And the United States had completed our victory in World War II. We had defeated the Nazis, we had defeated the Japanese, and so one of Truman's key tasks was to decide what's going to be America's new agenda in the world. What's the new issue that we're going to try to solve? And what he saw was that there were large portions of the world where people were living in fairly deep poverty. Most of these were areas that were just gaining their independence from their former colonial rulers after World War II. And so he said in his inaugural address that the United States should take on the mission of helping these countries to develop, helping these countries to achieve a high level of economic prosperity similar to what we see in the United States. So development refers to these increases in the material standard of living for people in different parts of the world. Development focuses on material standard of living, the amount of wealth, the amount of physical health that people are able to access. Development has remained a major agenda item for all presidents since Truman, up through the present, as well as for most leaders of other countries of the world. So both the rich countries and the poor countries have seen development of the poor countries, have seen raising the material standards of living in the poor countries of the world as a crucial item that the world needs to cooperate to achieve, even though they may have deep differences about how they think the best way to go about achieving development might be. When we talk about development, we have a series of terms that we use for the richer and poorer countries of the world. And it's important to understand what each set of terminology implies about the process of development. So take the terms developed and developing countries. We often hear these terms used to refer to the richer and poorer parts of the world. The implication that this terminology gives is that development is a single trajectory. And you see in the picture there one particular famous model of how development occurs, that it's a single process that all countries are going through. Some of them have gotten through this process, so they are now fully developed. Other countries are still working on it. They've lagged behind in their progress, but they're still moving along that same trajectory. So they're still developing. So the implication here is that each country will on its own go through this process at some greater or slower speed. And so the goal then would be to help the slower countries to catch up, to help them go through this same development process that the rich countries have already gone through. Another set of terminology that we sometimes hear is we talk about the first world and the third world. And this is common these days in the hashtag first world problems. And you see that hashtag put on things when people are complaining about something that is, in the grand picture, fairly inconsequential. You know, the store was out of my favorite brand of yogurt. Hashtag first world problems. The implication being that's something that only someone who's living in a rich part of the world, who has a really good life already, would have time to worry about. These terms, first world and third world, come from the Cold War. During the Cold War, we had two competing models of development. So rather than development being a single trajectory that all countries are going through, we actually had two different models of development. One was the capitalist or free market model that was pushed by the United States and Western Europe. The other model was the communist model of development, being pushed by the Soviet Union. So we had some countries that had fully developed according to one or another of these models. The countries that had fully developed using the capitalist or free market model, we called the first world. Countries that had fully developed using the communist or planned economy model, we called the second world. The remaining countries of the world were countries that had not committed to one or the other of these paths, that had not definitely gone down either the capitalist or communist path. And so the United States and the Soviet Union were fighting over the ability to get these countries to join one side or the other. So these countries that had not committed to the capitalist or communist path of development, these countries that had not developed fully along one of those trajectories, were referred to as the third world. Now today, the second world has largely disappeared. Most of the communist countries have had an economic collapse and have had to shift over to a much more free market type of economy. So the Soviet Union broke apart. Its constituent republics as well as its client states in Eastern Europe have switched over to a free market capitalist type of economy. And even China, which remains officially under the control of the Communist Party, has adopted market-based economic reforms on a broad scale. So we've essentially lost we've lost the second world, and we have only the first world and the third world left according to this set of terminology. Another set of terms you may hear is the North versus the South, usually with a capital N and capital S, sometimes referred to as the global North and the global South. These terms were originally created as an attempt to have a neutral way of describing the richer and poorer countries of the world. They didn't imply anything about the nature of the development process. They didn't give an indication of what would constitute development or what would be a good type of development. In practice, these terms are generally used by people on the political left who are critical of the capitalist path to economic development, who don't think that that type of development is the best thing for the whole world. So these terms are intended to be neutral. They just refer to directions, that the richer countries tend to be towards the northern part of the world, the poorer countries tend to be towards the southern part of the world. But in terms of who actually uses these terms, it's usually people on the political left. The final set of terminology that we'll encounter is the idea of a core versus a periphery. The core versus periphery terminology implies a model in which we have one global economic system. So instead of each individual country having its own economy that may develop in various ways, we have one global economy. And within that global economy, profit and wealth tend to flow towards one part of the world, the part that exercises control over the global economy. And that part then exerts power over other parts of the world in order to extract more profit. That part of the world that's accumulating the profits and the wealth, we call the core. The part that's having the profits taken from them and that's subject to outside power, we call the periphery. So in this model, the core got rich by exploiting and impoverishing the periphery. And that's what's implied if we talk about the world in terms of core versus periphery. We're implying a model in which the wealth of the rich nations came at the expense of the poor nations. Now, the same sets of countries are being referred to with all of these distinctions. So, North America, Western Europe, Japan, Japan, and the down under countries, Australia and New Zealand, are the countries we're referring to whether we say developed world, first world, global north, the core. And on the other hand, Latin America, Africa, and Asia are what we're generally referring to if we talk about the developing world, the third world, the global south, or the periphery. So all of these sets of terms refer to the same distinction between two groups of countries, but they imply different things about the nature of that distinction and how that distinction got created. In order to study development, we need to be able to measure it in some way. We need some sort of indicator to show us how developed a particular location is. And there are several different development indicators out there, depending on what aspect of development we want to focus on. So what we see here is a chart showing these development indicators for 4 representative countries: Denmark, the United States, Mexico, and Ghana. The first development indicator, and the one that's used most often, is gross domestic product, or GDP. Gross domestic product is the total value of all goods and services bought and sold within the territory of that country. And generally, when we talk about GDP, we're looking at the annual GDP per capita. In other words, the total value of all the buying and selling that happened within that country for a particular year divided by the population of that country. Because obviously a country with more people is going to have more buying and selling going on, is going to have a higher total GDP. But that doesn't necessarily mean the individual people within that country are any richer. So we need a larger GDP to take care of a larger population. So highlighted on the slide there, you see the gross domestic products of those countries. And so you can see that the United States has the highest GDP per capita, nearly $50,000 per person of goods and services being bought and sold within the United States in a given year. And we can see Denmark is a little ways behind us at about 36,000. Mexico's rather below that at about 14,000. And then Ghana is only a little over $1,000 per person per year worth of buying and selling of goods. Now, GDP focuses on economic exchanges in which money changes hands. In order to compile GDP statistics, governments have to collect information on all the buying and selling that's going on within their country. But that's not the entirety of the economic activity that's going on. And so this is why we may look at some countries that have tiny GDPs and wonder how those people manage to survive at all. Well, it's partly because a lot of the economic activity going on there is not happening in the market. It's not economic activity that involves an exchange of money. So activity on the black market is not going to factor into GDP because drug dealers and smugglers are not going to report those earnings to the government. And economic exchanges in which no money changes hands, barter and gifts, aren't going to factor into GDP. There's no price there. There's no money that's being exchanged. And so this leads to the situation where if I were to babysit your children for a day, and in exchange for that, you were to bake me a pie, that would be 0 GDP. No money has changed hands. That exchange of a service for a good would have no impact on GDP. However, if you paid me $15 to babysit your children, then I bought a pie from you for $15, that would add $30 to our GDP because there were 2 exchanges of $15 each, even though the end result in terms of who has what ends up being exactly the same. So measuring development according to GDP tends to encourage a focus on market activity, on people doing everything in exchange for money. And that means that certain sectors of society are going to get left out. So GDP has been criticized for ignoring women's work because women often do work that, while very important to prosperity within the country, is not compensated with money. If someone is doing household chores, they're not getting paid in money for that. Therefore, it doesn't factor into GDP, even though it's absolutely essential work for the society. Now, GDP per capita is an average. Obviously, not every person in the United States has $46,000 a year in wealth available to them. Some people have much more than that, some people have much less. So we can measure the inequality between the wealth levels of different people within a society with something called the Gini coefficient. And Gini is the last name of the economist who invented this particular indicator. So it's not an acronym, it shouldn't be written in all caps. The Gini coefficient is a measurement of the distribution of income within a society, and it can range anywhere from 0 to 1. A Gini coefficient of 0 is perfect equality. Everyone in that society has exactly the same amount of wealth. A Gini coefficient of 1 is perfect inequality. One person in that society has all the wealth, everyone else has nothing. Now, obviously not going to find any societies with a Gini coefficient of 0 or 1. Every country is going to be somewhere in the middle. You can see that the United States Gini coefficient is about 0.4. So we're kind of halfway in between perfect equality and perfect inequality. Denmark is a little more equal than the United States. And if you know anything about Scandinavian countries, that shouldn't come as a surprise to you, that government policy in those countries focuses very heavily on alleviating economic inequality, in taxing the rich very highly and providing generous welfare to the poor. And so it's not surprising that Denmark has a somewhat lower Gini coefficient than the United States. Mexico, on the other hand, has a substantially higher Gini coefficient than the United States. And in fact, that's true for most of Latin America. Those countries tend to be characterized by an extreme gap between the poor masses and a few very rich individuals. The current richest man in the world, in fact, is a Mexican named Carlos Slim. He is a cell phone magnate. So we see a huge gap between the poor and the rich in countries like Mexico that have a higher Gini coefficient. Another indicator of development is the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index was developed by the United Nations, intended to be a better measurement of development than a purely economic indicator like gross domestic product. Because just because you have a lot of money wealth doesn't mean that's necessarily translating into a higher material standard of living. So the Human Development Index combines 3 different factors. First, we have life expectancy. Life expectancy is a good, easily compiled, rough indicator of the health status of a population. If people are, on average, living a long time, that indicates good health in that population. If people tend to not live very long, that indicates poor health. And good health is one of the key pieces of material standard of living that we would hope that high income translates to. Second, we have education levels. Are people actually improving their own abilities? Are people able to learn to read and to go to school? That's another thing that we would hope that higher wealth is able to translate to. And so in the Human Development Index, we're going to measure that directly. And then the third aspect of the Human Development Index is GDP per capita. How much wealth do people actually have? When we combine those 3 things, we can get the Human Development Index. A Human Development Index of 1 would indicate a country that was the best country in the world on all 3 of those components. A country that had the highest life expectancy in the world, and the highest education level, and the highest GDP. Now, no country meets all 3 of those, so no country is quite at a 1, but some countries are pretty high. And what we can see here is that the United States and Denmark have almost identical Human Development Indexes. When we combine those 3 different things, we see that the United States and Denmark come out basically the same, even though the United States is substantially wealthier from a GDP standpoint. So that indicates that Denmark must be doing better than the United States in terms of education and or life expectancy to compensate for their lower level of monetary wealth, so that we'll come out at the same Human Development Index. You can see then that Mexico is somewhat lower, and then Ghana is not only poorer in money terms, but is also overall lower in the Human Development Index than the other countries shown here. Now, the Human Development Index, like the Gini coefficient and the GDP, are objective indicators. They're based on something that an outside observer can measure. An outside observer can see how much money people have. An outside observer can see how long people live. But raising our material standard of living is something that we ultimately pursue because we think people will be better off. People will be happier if they have a higher material standard of living. So some people have proposed that we should measure that directly. This is a much more complicated thing to do, to try to measure people's subjective satisfaction with how their life is going. And there are a variety of different indicators out there that attempt to do this. So on the chart there, I've got something called the Satisfaction with Life Index, which was one attempt to compile this kind of information about whether people are actually happy with their lives. And what you can see there is that there is somewhat of a correlation with wealth. That Ghana has the lowest Satisfaction with Life Index of the countries shown here. Mexico is in the middle. But then we see that Denmark is substantially ahead of the United States in their own satisfaction with life. And in fact, in any of these indicators, the Danes usually come out as the happiest country on earth. So that indicates that something else in Denmark, something other than just wealth, is also contributing to their happiness. That something about perhaps their greater health status, something about the level of economic inequality, or something not measured by any of these other indicators is making the Danes happier with their life than the average person in the United States.